Good evening. Hope you're doing well. Got a couple of problems with the congregation here. Maybe a couple people, would be a better way to say it. It's not you, honey. Good to see you, though. I'm glad you're here. But a couple things. One, Aaron Stice, every time I come here, he's gone. And he told me he planned his vacation around making sure he wasn't here. And I believe that. What a jerk. Person number two is Chad. I texted him this morning, and I said, hey, do you guys start at 7? And I'm still waiting for him to reply. So, I don't know. 7 o'clock. Perfect. I'll be ready. It's good to be here with you tonight. Glad you guys have a VBS coming up. I wanted to share just a couple quick stories about VBS for you because it can be easy to kind of go through the motions when you have something and you have it every year. And I wanted to share a couple of stories that might encourage you. A guy that worked with me for a decade at House to House, he has since got married and moved to a different state, has a different job. But he was invited to Vacation Bible School when he was 7, I think, and he went, had a good time, and then never went back to church again until about 5 years later, his mom went through a divorce and said, man, we could use some help. We need to seek God's wisdom in life, and we need to go to church somewhere. Well, where do we go to church? We're not really friends with anybody that goes to church. Oh, I know where we'll go. We'll go to the church that invited you to Vacation Bible School 5 years ago. And they went to church there and studied, and both of them were baptized, and she's currently a dorm mom at Freed Hardeman, and he worked with me at House to House for 10 years. Another one I know about, this was probably the 50s or the 60s. I didn't even know they were doing Vacation Bible School in the 50s, but that shows what I know. A girl at church invited a little girl she was friends with to VBS, and she said, sure, can my siblings come? And she said, yeah, come on. So she took her 5 siblings with her, and they walked to the Vacation Bible School. And out of that family that went to that Vacation Bible School, 3 of the boys became preachers, and all of the sisters married preachers, just from an invitation to Vacation Bible School. What can happen with your Vacation Bible School next week? No idea, but probably very little if you don't invite anybody. But who knows what happens if you can invite someone? Anything could happen. So take that serious, take that opportunity, invite some people. Our lesson tonight, I know we're trying to talk about imitating Christ, and the topic I've been assigned is Nehemiah. It's one of my favorite books, so I'm really excited to share some of the things about Nehemiah. You ever watch a movie and they'll show you the end, and then they spend the rest of the movie explaining how they got to the end? I typically don't care for that, but sometimes it's okay. But I feel like that's what's happened tonight with the verse that we were assigned, and let's read that together. And this is really the end of the story of Nehemiah. It's not the end of the book, but it's kind of the pinnacle of what Nehemiah has been trying to do. So let's read that and then build up to it. So Chad assigned us this, Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6. And we'll look at some different verses tonight, but we'll mainly be in Nehemiah. So you can just turn there and stay with us there tonight. But Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6 says this, so we built the wall. Well, that's kind of the whole point of the book, is to go back and to rebuild the wall. And so here Chad has asked us to go ahead and tell basically the punchline of the story. So verse 6, we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height. And here's the key, for the people had a mind to work. Man, if the people have a mind to work, you can get just about anything done. If people don't have a mind to work, it's hard to get very much done. And so Nehemiah's got this great story of how the people wanted to work, and so a lot was accomplished. The second verse Chad assigned us is chapter 6 and verse 3, if you want to read that. It says, I sent messengers to them saying, I'm doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? And so the whole book of Nehemiah is building up to, can they rebuild the wall? And here we see basically the end of the story that they did. But let's look back at the beginning of the story and see how they get to this point of accomplishing this great feat, this great task. So look at Nehemiah chapter 1, and we'll walk through several things there. Now briefly, before we jump into Nehemiah so that we'll know what's going on, I want to give you some background. It would be like visiting Gettysburg, but you've never heard of the Civil War. Visiting Gettysburg isn't going to do you much good unless you know about the context of this place. And so Nehemiah is like that too. So I want to give us a little bit of background so we understand what Nehemiah is going through. Does anyone ever find it hard to understand the Old Testament? I mean, I'm just curious if anyone thinks the Old Testament is confusing at times. All right, if you feel that way, Genesis chapter 12 is a chapter that can help you understand the whole rest of the Old Testament. And in that chapter, God is going to make 3 promises to Abraham. Now, you remember Abraham is old, past the time of having children, but God promises to him, I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm going to give you a kid, not only a kid, but a big army of people is going to come from your family. That's promise number one. Promise number two is, well, if you got people, you got to have a place for them to live, so I'm going to give you a land. And as you march through Genesis, you see, well, that's the land of Canaan. That's the promised land. And then promise number three, and this is the most important one, is that Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, Emmanuel, the Savior, the Messiah, the solution for sin, is going to come through Abraham's family. Now, he doesn't at that point say Jesus. Well, why? Well, he hasn't been born yet. He hasn't been named. And he's not going to get real specific. But he says, through your seed, something's going to happen that will bless everyone. Everyone that's ever going to live, everyone that ever has lived, and everyone that's currently living. That could only be Jesus. And as we turn to the New Testament, we read several passages where it's referenced back to Genesis 12, and we're shown that that's the promise of Jesus coming through Abraham. So what are the three promises? I'll make of you a great nation, I'll give you land, and Jesus will come through your family. The whole rest of the Old Testament is about those three promises being fulfilled. So if you ever are stumbling through the Old Testament and you say, what's going on in this passage? God is working, amongst other things, at least to fulfill those three promises. He's giving Abraham a great nation, or he's marching them towards the land and giving it to them, or he's getting the people ready for Jesus to eventually come through Abraham's family. And so it's through that background that we march all the way through to the book of Nehemiah. And we get to the second promise. Remember that God is going to give them a great land. And so God does that, and Abraham's descendants grow large and they settle in the land of Canaan. But they learned something from Abraham. They learned about the way that he handled problems. And it's actually the opposite of the way Nehemiah handles problems, which is what we're going to look at tonight. But here's what Abraham did when there was a problem. He thought, what should I do? How should I handle this? And then he did it. He handled problems on his own and in his own way. For example, he lied about who his wife was. He tried to have God's promise of, you're going to have a great nation, through his servant. God said no. Through another woman. God said no. And then finally he was specific. It's going to be through your wife, Sarah. And so when Abraham tried to handle a problem, took it into his own hands, things went poorly. His descendants learned from him. And instead of handling problems with God in God's way, they tried to handle it on their own. And that mindset caused them to lose the promised land. So God gave it to him and said, you'll have it as long as you obey. And if you don't obey, that will be taken away from you. And so time and time again, they disobeyed God, and eventually that promised land was taken. So God allowed the 10 northern tribes to be taken into captivity by the Babylonians. And when they did that, they assimilated. They were taken to Babylon, and by and large, they talked their language. They ate their way. They had their customs. They assimilated, and it just kind of became like the people that were there. They became kind of half Babylonian, half Jewish, and that's the group that became known as the Samaritans. That's important because as you read through Nehemiah, there's going to be a guy, Sanballat, who is a Samaritan, who is always getting in the way of God's people. He's always trying to stop the rebuild. Well, that's because he's a half Jew and a half Babylonian. So Nehemiah, our character that we're looking at tonight, he is a descendant of Jews that were taken out of the promised land and taken captive and put in Babylon. Now Persia is going to take over Babylon, and their ruler is going to let some people go back to Jerusalem for different political reasons. Okay, so let's summarize that quickly. God says to Abraham, I'm going to give you a great nation and land for that nation. So God keeps that promise, as God always does. Eventually they're given the promised land, the land of Canaan, but God says, this is yours conditionally. You didn't build these houses you're going to live in. You didn't plant the vineyards you're going to eat from. You need to remember that it's me that gave it to you, and you need to act accordingly. And if you do, you keep it. If you don't, it will be taken. And they didn't. And so God took the land and allowed people to come and get the inhabitants, God's chosen people, and put them in a different country. And eventually, after they're there for a while, God works it out through these political rulers, and some of them go back. And Nehemiah is one of those who's going to go back. And as Nehemiah goes back, his job is to rebuild the wall of the city around Jerusalem. As we pick up in Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah is going to be addressing a 100-year-old problem. Have you ever tried to tackle a problem that you see and it's bigger than you are? You might be in a city with two congregations that split, and you say, I want to work towards unity. If it's personality-driven, let's get these people in a room and let's talk it out and let's fix this. We're going to be in heaven together and we can't work in the same city together. Or if it's doctrinal, let's talk about it. If we agree that this is the standard, surely we can come to a conclusion. That sounds really easy. Why don't we just do that all over the country? Because it's hard. Sometimes it's bigger than us. And so Nehemiah is going to face a problem that has been a problem for 100 years. The walls are in ruin. How do you fix a problem that big? The second thing that might be helpful is you're understanding the Old Testament. By the time you get to Nehemiah, if you want to just kind of hold that in your hands where you are, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, that's the end of inspiration before Jesus comes. Everything that's after that in the Old Testament fits back in somewhere earlier. For example, this is years after David. Well, yes, but the book of Psalms comes after Nehemiah. That's because it goes in earlier into the Old Testament. So once we get to Nehemiah and Esther, that's it. And it's about 450 years until Jesus comes. All of the Psalms, all of the Proverbs, all of the prophets go back in earlier somewhere else in the Old Testament. That makes it confusing for us to understand, but just realize this, Nehemiah is only about 400, 450 years from Jesus. So that's where we are in history as we look at Nehemiah. So with that in mind, look at Nehemiah chapter 1. At the end of chapter 1, Nehemiah tells us that he is a cup-bearer to the king, and that's important because it's going to explain why verses 1 through 3 happen. So look at verses 1 through 3. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakkalah, now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa the citadel, that Hananiah, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province, who had survived the exile, is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Okay, so a group comes from Jerusalem to the king to give a summary of the work, to give a report. And their report is, the work is not going well. We're not getting anything done. The city lies in shambles. There is no wall. We're a laughingstock, and it's to our shame. Now, when the king hears this, he doesn't do anything about it, seemingly. But do you know who else is there in the room and overhears it? Nehemiah. You know, the king is not a Jew, but you know who is? Nehemiah. King doesn't care that much, seemingly, but do you know who does? Nehemiah. I wonder if they even came and gave the king a report at all because they knew Nehemiah would be there and be in earshot. And even if the king didn't care and didn't help, Nehemiah may be able to have some influence with the king and get something done about this 100-year-old problem. You know what happens when we hear a problem? Put yourself in the shoes of Nehemiah for a minute. That's what we'll do for a few minutes. Think about what happens when you hear a problem. I can tell you what I've been conditioned by society and culture to do, especially as a man in America. What do you do when you hear a problem? You come up with a solution. I'm the answer to this problem. I can fix this. Let's get to work. And we start making plans and we make decisions and we put people to work. And you know what happens when I do that, right? Occasionally I get lucky, and it actually works. That does happen sometimes, despite my best efforts probably. But more often than not, if my first step is, aha, I'm the solution, let me fix this, I create more problems than I solve. So what we see happen with Nehemiah is really the answer for all of our problems that we have. Look at verse 4. What I do when I hear a problem, what can I do to fix it? What does Nehemiah do when he hears a problem? Verse 4, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So Nehemiah's immediate reaction, and this is important, is not to formulate a plan. It's good to have a plan, but that's not the best first step. Nehemiah's first response to this is that he is broken. This is a 100-year-old problem. And remember, what's Nehemiah's job? He's a cupbearer for the king. He's a glorified taste tester. He has absolutely no business trying to rebuild a wall. Somebody like Blake could. I think Blake could handle that. He's got a lot of experience. Nehemiah doesn't. Nehemiah is a glorified taste tester. And there's some other things that he did, but he has no experience. And because of that, he's simply just broken about the condition of Jerusalem and the problem his people are having. And you know, maybe that's where true leadership begins, is by being broken about the problem. In Psalm chapter 51, David is discussing his sin with Bathsheba. I mean, that makes me, I'm afraid to even talk about that. That's so heinous. I mean, it makes me blush to even think about what he did. And he's talking about that in Psalm 51. And here's what he says in verse 17. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. You can keep going through the motions. You can keep doing something just because that's the way we've always done it. You can keep doing something just because you have to. You can keep money just to give it and be seen for it. God doesn't want that. What God wants is worship that comes from a broken heart and a contrite spirit. That's what Nehemiah's first reaction was. He didn't have a sense of personal strength. He actually had a sense of his limitations and a belief that he really needed God. Not that it's nice to have God in addition to what else we have, but that God is all that we have. You know, the problem with our confidence is that it leads us to think things, believe things like, I don't need help, or I can do this on my own. I don't need accountability. We become overconfident, self-confident, and we don't ask for help. The positives when you come to a situation broken, with a contrite spirit, a broken heart, is that you know that you need help. You know that you need accountability. You're not self-confident, but you're God-confident and God-centered, and you will ask for help. So again, the problem, 100 years of despair. The city lies in ruin because the wall is down and lies in ruin. The solution, Nehemiah has no idea, but he knows that he needs God. That's our solution for everything. What am I going to do to fix this? I have no idea, but I know that I need God. All right, next, look at verse 5. So Nehemiah is broken. Then look at verse 5. Here's the next thing he does. He said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. So the first thing Nehemiah does is he realizes he's not the answer. He's broken about his condition, about the problem. The second thing he does is he immediately goes to God. You know, I love the verse 1 Thessalonians 5:17. Anybody know what that says? Pray without ceasing. All right, very good, very good. Pray without ceasing. And that verse, when you just pull it out of context, is good. It just means we pray all the time. But have you ever looked at the verse right before it and the verse right after it? Verse 16 says that we're to rejoice always. And verse 18 says, give thanks in all circumstances. So as we think about praying all the time, why? Well, it's sandwiched between two verses that tell us to be thankful. In context, it's as if I'm so thankful for what God is giving me that I cannot help but pray. My natural reaction is to constantly say to God, thank you, thank you, thank you, because of how blessed I am. Everything in our life should make us immediately go to God. We get ourselves in trouble when we try to handle it without first seeing what God would have us to do and asking for his help. For Nehemiah, when he faced a problem, his natural reaction before he tried to fix it was to turn to God for help. In Jeremiah 10:23, you see the same idea. Jeremiah says, I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man to direct his own steps. You know what happens when we direct our own steps, right? We get in trouble. Back in Psalm 37, verse 23, it says it this way. The steps of a man are established by the Lord when he delights in his way. The steps of a man are established by the Lord. You know who wrote that? David. What happened when David established his own steps? He messed things up. He messed up God's people for a long time. He did things that I think we're even dealing with the consequences of today. One of the best men the Bible has to offer and did some of the worst things that you see in the Bible. Well, why? Because he directed his own steps instead of letting God. Then look at the next verse. Here's the next thing Nehemiah did. So he's broken about the condition and he knows I'm not the solution, God is. He turns to God. Then look at verses 6 through 7. Nehemiah is going to take personal accountability. He's going to confess sin and repent. Verse 6, let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open, he's saying to God, to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. Verse 7, we've acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. You know, if you have a problem in your life, you may not be qualified to fix it. But like Nehemiah, you may not even be qualified to try yet. You may need to make some things right with God first before you're even qualified to try to tackle your problem. You know, confession, we use the term confession. We're talking about becoming a Christian and then how we live, but confession is just pulling up alongside the truth. So for example, when you and I say, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, does us saying that make it any more or less true? No, of course not. We're just saying what's already true. Now, Jesus Christ is the Son of God, whether you and I believe it or act like it or not. But when we confess, we pull up alongside that truth and we see things as God sees them. Here in verses 6 and 7 of Nehemiah chapter 1, the people are full of sin. They're eaten up with it. They're riddled with it. Nehemiah says that he is as well. And that's the truth whether Nehemiah wants to admit it or not. But as he starts to make the problem better, he admits that sin, he confesses it, and he sees things the way God would. Look at verses 8 through 9. You know, I used to, as someone would lead a prayer and they would tell God something, like they would remind him of something, I would think, it's kind of silly to tell God like what he already told us. Like he knows. You know, don't preach a sermon. It's a prayer. Let's ask for things and be thankful. But Nehemiah actually he does that. He tells God something God already knows and reminds him. So I've changed my mind on that. But look at what he does, verses 8 through 9. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I'll scatter you among the peoples. And the key here, verse 9, but if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. Nehemiah is realizing something. We did not lose this city because we didn't have a good enough army. We didn't lose this city because God lost the battle or because there was someone stronger than us. We lost this city because we didn't obey God. We're not going to go back in there and rebuild it and be able to live there again unless we fix the thing that made us lose it in the first place. And so he confesses their sin, he repents of that, and says, I'm making a pledge to return back to your ways and to the best of my ability to bring the people of God with me, because we acknowledge we didn't lose this because you're weak. We lost this because we left you. And we're returning to you now, and we're asking you to give us back the wall and the city. He realizes the importance of returning and repenting. And he's teaching us the value of taking personal responsibility for our sin. We may have a problem in our life, and we may say, hey, God, please take this away from me. And God will help, but he will also give us the tools to help ourselves. So not only does Nehemiah want to get well and want to fix the problem, but he admits that he's part of the problem. And not only does he admit that he's part of the problem, but he's willing to do whatever it takes to fix it. Do you want to get well? Well, you have to start with God and then do whatever it takes. We understand that sin is our biggest problem and God is our only answer. Now look at chapter 2 and verse 1. So Nehemiah has been broken about his sin. It's kind of like the day of Pentecost when they hear they've crucified Jesus. What's their first reaction? They're pricked in their heart. They had tender hearts. There are some of us, when we hear the gospel message, we get chills. We cry sometimes. We change our life. We make notes and we try to work better. Some of us, when we hear it, it's just like trying to, bounce like quarters off the ground. It's too hard. Nothing can go into it. Nothing can penetrate it. And so a hard heart is the enemy of the gospel. So in Acts 2, they were pricked in their heart. They had soft and tender hearts. Nehemiah, when he hears the problem, he's brokenhearted. He has a soft and tender heart. Then from that, he immediately turns to God, and then he takes accountability and responsibility for the problem. And here's what happens next. Look at chapter 2 and verse 1. In the month of Nisan, and this is 4 months later, so Nehemiah has addressed the problem, gone before God and been broken, but he still has to wait a while to get an answer, to get a yes. So 4 months later, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So think about this. Why would Nehemiah not want to be sad in the presence of the king? Well, because the king is dealing with top shelf problems, and he doesn't have time to hear that Nehemiah's had a bad day, and his girlfriend broke up with him, and his tummy hurts, and his pet puppy ran away. Because that may be important to Nehemiah, but it's not important to the ruler of the country who's dealing with everything. And so if you're sad in the presence of the king, you run the risk of being fired or even worse, being killed. That's why in the story of Esther, Mordecai says, go talk to the king, and she's scared to do it. I don't want to go talk to the king. If I go in there and he hasn't called me, he may kill me. Well, it makes the king seem bad, and that's true probably, but also they're dealing with big problems. They don't need to be annoyed by little problems that are the other person's situation. So Nehemiah is sad in front of the king, which he has never done, because that's not what you do in front of a king. But in chapter 2, verse 1, he is. Now look at verse 2. The king could have said, you're fired. The king could have said, kill this guy and get me somebody who's not going to mope about. But he said, why is your face sad, seeing you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. And then I was very much afraid. So the king asked Nehemiah, what's wrong? Now what do we say to each other as we come in and out of this building? How are you? And what do we say back every time? I'm good. I'm good. Now, a couple things to think about there. When someone asks, how are you, do they mean it? Sometimes. Some of us actually do mean it. We would say, yeah, for sure, I actually legitimately want to know. But not everyone means that. Not everyone really wants to know. Sometimes you're like, oh, great, I'd like to tell you. And they're like, oh, man, I didn't sign up for this. I was just saying hello. So not everyone actually means it. And then the second thought is this. What do we say back? Typically, we say, I'm good. Are you sometimes good? Yeah, I think so. Most of us. Even whoever has the toughest life in here is probably sometimes good. So yeah, sure, sometimes we're good. Are you always good? Now, whoever has even the best life among us in here is not always good. So the idea is this. Who do you actually answer that question, how are you, to? Now, not everyone wants to know, so let's not answer it for real to everybody. And if you're a male struggling with pornography, it might not be the best idea to answer it to the 3-year-old little girl or the 80-year-old lady at church. But find someone that you legitimately answer that question, how are you, to? And that's what we're going to see that Nehemiah does. One more note before we look at his answer in verse 3. Even after praying, how does Nehemiah feel? Even after he's prayed to God, how does Nehemiah feel? He still feels horrible. He's still sad. He's afraid. A good note for us is that sometimes praying alone is not enough. Now let's look at his answer in verse 3. The king says, why are you sad? Don't tell me you just don't feel well. This is heart sadness. Verse 3, I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why shouldn't I be sad? Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, we could even insert in parentheses there. He doesn't say it. Maybe he's not thinking, but the promised land that God told my father Abraham all the way back in Genesis 12 he was going to give us, that we looked forward to for years as we marched around in the wilderness, as we fought armies, that land lies in ruin, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Now, Nehemiah does something wild when he's asked, what's wrong? He actually answers the question honestly. Now, what do we typically do with our feelings? Most of the time, we bottle those up, which is understandable that we don't want to be going around being an open book for everyone. But for us tonight, the idea is, do we actually honestly say how we're doing to anyone? Now, why is this important about being honest with our feelings? Well, one main reason is that when we don't share our feelings with those that we would like to have a relationship with, it actually keeps us insulated from them. It keeps us isolated. It keeps us separated and distant. When we're isolated like that, we're not honest with our feelings, it's going to leave us lonely. It's going to leave us without strength, without the community of each other. But that community is what we actually need to make change. You know, we're not ready to really be part of a community or be part of even the church, really, unless we're willing to be honest about our feelings and the things that we need, and we can ask for help. If you're trying to make a change in your life, maybe it's addiction, maybe it's anger, some secret sin, if you're tired of being anxious, depressed, lonely, you know, that's a tough place to be by yourself. Can you imagine trying to overcome any of the things on this list or others you could think of by yourself? But that's what a lot of us try to do. And if you do that, if you try to fix a problem, especially a hard problem, maybe a 100-year problem, on your own, you're not using all the tools that God has given you. Ashley and I flip houses. One cool thing about that's a strong sentence. You can say you flip houses if you've done 2 or if you've done 2,000. We're much closer to the smaller number. But we'll sometimes get somewhere, I'm not prepared all the time, and we'll need to fix something, and I don't have the proper tool. Blake, you ever tried to drive in a nail with a screwdriver? You haven't? Man, that's experience for you. I have. I'll tell you what happens. Sometimes it works. Most of the time it breaks the plastic end off and it chips off. You know? Sometimes you can get the job done with the wrong tool, but most of the time it doesn't work. Well, why not? Well, it wasn't intended to. You're not using the tool that was made for the job. A lot of times it's hard, and most of the time it's impossible. If you're trying to overcome a problem in your life by yourself, you are trying to do the job with the wrong tool. And it probably won't work. If it does, it'll be hard. In most cases, it'll be impossible. I wanted to share, I didn't do a PowerPoint, but maybe you can see, I wanted to share a list of everyone in the Bible who did it on their own. And I can give you this list later. You can take a picture and screenshot it. But I don't know if you can see that. But that is the blank side of a sheet of paper. Because nobody in the Bible did it on their own. And when they tried, they got themselves into trouble. Now, we might be tempted to say, well, of course, Jesus did it on his own. But he didn't. When he was tempted in the wilderness, you remember what happened right before that? He's baptized by John the Baptist and receives the Holy Spirit. And as soon as that temptation is done, he's ministered to by angels, and he selects his apostles. Jesus didn't do it on his own, and the reason for that is we are not designed to do it on our own. We're fighting against the model that God has created if we try. But hey, if you want to do it on your own, try it. Maybe you'll be the first person. And that would be pretty impressive. So as the king asked Nehemiah, "How are you?" what does Nehemiah do? He actually answers the question and he talks about his feelings. I want to pause for just a minute and think about some obstacles to doing what Nehemiah did, to being honest, and to talking about our feelings, and see if we can maybe address some ways to overcome that. What are some reasons someone might not be comfortable actually saying what they need or talking about their feelings? Well, one reason might be that they've just never done it. There's some things I might be good at or enjoy, but I have no idea because I've never tried them. And it's hard to start something you've never tried. We might not want to be honest about how we feel because we've just never done it. Maybe we've never seen it done. There's some things as parents that Ashley and I do that our parents didn't do, that we hope is good, we think it's good, but we're just trying to kind of figure it out as we go because we've just never seen it done. Our parents did a great job, and we want to even add to that and do some additional things. We're just figuring it out. We don't know because we've never seen it done, and that makes some of it harder. Sometimes we might not see the benefit. Well, I don't know about talking about my feelings or letting people know what I'm struggling with, asking for help. What good's that going to do? We might not see a benefit in it. We might also be afraid. Someone might actually think that we're not perfect and that we don't have it all together if we're honest about something we're dealing with. That would be scary. In our culture, we think it's weak. The American mindset of, I'm a self-made man, I can do it all on my own, is pretty prevalent, even creeps into our thinking sometimes, and we might see it as a weakness if we said there was something that we needed help with. We might even think that it's unchristian to talk about struggles or to talk about problems. But what happens when you bottle pressure? Have any of you ever done like a science experiment where you take like a Diet Coke and you drop, like a Tums or something into it and shake it up, or Mentos? I don't know exactly. Science wasn't my strong point, no problem. We'll move on. What happens to that? Well, eventually so much pressure builds up, so much fizz builds up that you might even have an explosion or the top pops off or something like that. Well, what happens to us when we bottle up our feelings and our emotions and the tough stuff? The exact same thing is going to happen. So you and I, we have a blessing. We get to choose how we let out our feelings and our emotions. We can pick it. We can decide. We can decide who we share it with, and we can let it out. Or they will come out all on their own in some other way. Have you ever seen someone just fly off the handle angry? You're like, man, where did that come from? They went like 0 to 60 so quick. Well, they had suppressed something that built up and came out in a way they didn't choose at a time they didn't choose, just like all emotions do. If we don't share those things, we don't ask for help, then we end up with distractions, coping mechanisms. We may even end up living a double life. This is the real me. This is the me that I'll let people see. So sharing that is very important. What do you do with those feelings? If we don't discuss it, it can be isolating. You might want to make a note to 2 Samuel 13. This is another one of those stories, like you almost can't believe it's in the Bible because it's so atrocious, but it's one reason we know the Bible's true. It didn't hide any of the messy stuff. And in 2 Samuel 13, Tamar is assaulted and raped by her brother Amnon. And when her brother Absalom hears about it, we might think he's going to fly off the handle, call the cops, tell the king, whatever the case may be. But look at verse 20, 2 Samuel 13, verse 20. Here's the advice that her brother Absalom gives Tamar. He says, hold your peace. Can you imagine? Hold your peace. This may be the worst advice ever given in the history of the world. Hold your peace. It's as if he's saying, look, you don't want to give our brother a bad name. You don't want to make life politically hard for our dad. You don't want that kind of thing associated with you. You don't want to be that kind of woman. Let's just not talk about that anymore. And here's the price she pays for doing that. Because of that, the verse says that Tamar lived the rest of her life as a desolate woman, an empty woman. You know, desolation, emptiness, lack of real relationship, that's the price that we pay for never talking about how we feel, about being real with what we're dealing with. If you're trying to get through life, handling everything on your own, doing things on your own, we're not using all the tools that God gave us. Sometimes you're using the wrong tool for the job. You know, don't really answer how are you to everyone, but find some people that you do actually answer that question to. And look at how the king responds. Look at verse 4. Because Nehemiah is honest about how he is and he shares his feelings, see how the king responds. Verse 4. The king, in verse 4, said to me, what are you requesting? So again, Nehemiah goes to God. I prayed to the God of heaven. So the king has heard his feelings because he's been honest about it. He says, what can I do to help? You know, people may not know that you need something until you ask. Did you know that? Let's do an exercise. How many of you would mow the grass for someone else in here if they needed some help? Raise your hand if you would do that. Oh, yeah, I'm taking notes. I'm going to call some of you guys. Honey, I don't think you raised your hand. Okay, well, hey, we know where we stand. It's good to be honest, you know? All right, how many of you, if one of us called and said, hey, look, I was on vacation, I forgot to tell the bank, and they've locked my credit card, and I need some cash today, how many of you would send some money to somebody that called in a situation like that from the people that are in here? All right, Ashley, take notes. Fleece this church, you know. Do you see how many people raised their hand? In both of those situations, some overlap, some different people, but several people raised their hands. You know, now how about this? How many of you said, let me know if you ever need anything? Let me know if I can help. Has anybody said that? I would say the majority of us look like we have said that at some point. All right? The church is very giving. I have found that to be the case. If there is something that arises that there's a need for, the church is very giving and is very quick to help. Now, if I ask this, how many of you have called someone up and said, I need help? How many of us would be able to raise our hand? Well, for sure some, but don't you think probably less people have called and said, I need help, than have been willing to help? Now, do you see a problem that could come from that? We've got 200 people here willing to help, and only one person willing to ask for help. You're going to have a surplus of people saying, put me to work, let me serve, I'm willing to sacrifice, I'll love, I'll give, I'll help, I'll show up, I'll do whatever I can. And then we have an army of people saying, no, I can do everything on my own, I don't need any help, I don't need anything. And when you do that, you rob everyone else of the benefit and the blessing of doing what God intended for them to do and designed them to do and to help. And so people may not know that we need something unless we ask. How many people have left the church mad? Oh, the church didn't help me. I promised they would have. Did you ask? Most of the time, too, we could do a better job of opening our eyes and seeing a need. You know, I've heard of preachers going to visit, or just Christians going to visit somebody's home, and they leave and they say, hey, if you need anything, let me know after a surgery. And they walk past a sink full of dirty dishes, and they kick off the weeds off the sidewalk as they pass grass up to their waist. If you need anything, let me know. They do. Just open your eyes and look. So we could do a better job of both. But here in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 5, Nehemiah asks for what he really needs. Look at verse 5. I said to the king, if it pleases the king, And if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. Verse 6, the request pleases the king. Verse 7, Nehemiah feels empowered to ask for help with supplies and safe passage. Well, think about yourself. What do you need? Do you need somebody to talk to get some help from? Do you need to share a sin? Look, you've tried to overcome it since you were in high school, since you were in college, since you first got married, since you guys had kids, since you moved, over and over and over, and you've got 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 60 years of not having overcome it. Do you need to try maybe a different tool and see if maybe talking to someone about that could make it easier for you to overcome it? Is there a place in your life where you've plateaued and you've peaked and you could just use some help with experience, with mentorship, discipleship, advice, whatever it is? It amazes me sometimes how people, and I was guilty of this, I'm trying to do better, but my whole life I grow up and I'm like, well, I want to be successful and do well and be happy. And how many times I missed out on asking someone who had what I wanted how to get it, what I could do better, where I could improve. You know, hey, I want a great marriage. Oh man, great goal. Who have you talked to that's got a good marriage? Nobody. Man, I hope my kids grow up to be Christians. Who have you talked to who all their children are faithful and said, hey, what'd you do? What shouldn't I do? What would you have done different? Nobody. Man, I'd like to be rich one day. Great. How many rich people do you know? None. How many of you ask for advice? None. It shouldn't surprise us if we can't get to where we want to be if we don't ask for help, if we don't have examples. And so what do you need help in? Nehemiah was willing to ask for it, and because he did, he got the help that he needed. With the last maybe couple of minutes, I just want us to look at Acts chapter 2 and notice a couple of things. If you'll flip over there, this is where we'll end our lesson tonight. So you and I are part of something called the Restoration Movement, whether we know it or not, and it has a very noble goal. It's to not revamp, reform, fix a couple of mistakes with the church that we're in, but to just completely say, forget denominationalism, forget opinions and creeds and tradition, and let's do just what they did in the Bible. And if we do just that, we'll be just what they are. And that's our goal. And by and large, I think we're doing a good job of that. If you look at Acts 2, it's a great place to go back and say, hey, look, let's start with a fresh start. We should be able to move somewhere as a group, start a church, and if we just use this as our guide, be basically what we are here now and be what they were in Acts 2. And I think we've done a great job of that with the terms of membership, with the plan of salvation. We have not compromised that. It's just what you read about in Acts 2. When someone says, oh man, I've messed up, I've sinned, what should I do? We say the same thing Peter said, repent and be baptized. So we've got that. We've restored that. Good for us. That's a good thing. We should continue to do so. What about worship? It's very simple. There's nothing flashy here. It doesn't even matter about the messenger as much as the message. And so we've restored worship by and large like they did in Acts 2, I think. I think we've done that. But what about some of the other things? Or maybe there's some things that we've missed out on restoring, and that's what I want to look at in our last few minutes. Look at Acts chapter 2. Look at verses 42 through 47. And this is just hammering in on that idea of you weren't made to do it alone. Well, how did the early church respond to problems? We see what Nehemiah did. He was broken, and he took it to God, and he took personal responsibility. What did this early church we're trying to recreate, how did they handle problems? All right, look at verses 42 through 47. For sake of time, we won't read all that, but I want you to notice the words fellowship, together, and day by day. Look at verse 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, and here it is, fellowship. Verse 44, all who believed were together. Verse 46, day by day, attending the temple. Verse 47 at the end, and the Lord added to their number day by day. Sometimes we think, what's the bare minimum I can get away with being around the church? And we miss the point completely. The early church was together often. If we're really, truly concerned with restoration and restoring the New Testament church, we will be together more often. It doesn't mean we have to be together all day, every day, but it means more than Sunday mornings. And it means more than Sunday morning and Wednesday night. It means being a part of each other's lives. Now, the problem with that is it may mess up our schedules. But the positive is it may save our soul, and it may make us more like the early church, and we may see a lot of benefit from that. How did the early church handle problems? Well, they did it together. Look at the next thing. Well, actually, let me mention this before we move on to verse 44. Proverbs 27:17 says, iron sharpens iron. And that's a great verse to put on a t-shirt for a men's day. I mean, it's a great verse. But you know, the problem is if iron never comes in contact with iron, it doesn't do diddly squat. You put iron that's dull over there and iron that's dull over here, and you'll never sharpen them. Why? They have to come in contact. It's the same thing. If we're going to strengthen each other, we actually have to be around each other. and we have to come in contact with each other. We'll take a break for just a minute, and we'll finish up our last 2 points after the kiddos come in. Thanks so much.